So this is part 4, and it covers from just north of Leeming Bar all the way down through Leeming and eventually down as far as Heelan Bridge, which is where all this started off. And this is about the upgrade to motorway between 2009 and 2012, and the effect it had on properties along the roadside. And these were properties, of course, which were there long before the motor car, some of them even before the days of the stagecoach, so they'd seen dramatic changes, but nothing quite as dramatic as arrived in 2009 when most of them were bulldozed into oblivion. In the early 1990s, an upgrade of Leeming Lane to motorway was proposed, and property alongside the dual carriageway was bought up, land was bought up at great expense. So it was all systems go. But in 1997, John Prescott, now Baron Prescott, became the rather grandly titled Secretary of State for the Environment, Transport and the Regions. A real mouthful. And he scrapped it. He scrapped this upgrade after all this property had been bought up. All this effort had been put in. And of course the properties standing empty when the families had moved out, or the farmers had moved out, were just ransacked. Anything of any value had disappeared. But the Ministry of Transport sold them off for a song, and the people who bought them knew that at some time in the future they were going to be repurchased. But if you played your cards right, you could make a tidy profit. And true enough, 10 years later, the upgrade to motorway was back on the agenda, and all this property was repurchased. Questions were asked in the Houses of Parliament about this, and this is a document about this question in the Houses of Parliament, to which Glenda Jackson, a former actress but now an MP, had to respond. And it would seem that the whole farce had cost the taxpayer £5 million, money which could have been used far better elsewhere. Starting at the very north, where the now demolished Leazes Lane Bridge crosses the Leeming bypass, we can work our way south and see how the changes in Dere Street, or the Great North Road, or the A1 or the A1M have blighted properties all the way south to Dishforth. The first one we come to is Fairfield House, which is on the right hand side of Leeming Lane, just north of Leeming Bar. Most of its land was taken for road junctions and to build a large services area, which is where the Shell services are now at Leeming Bar. Enormous place. The farmhouse is still there, but I suspect it's going to be knocked down in the none too distant future. And so this is just a few shots of that there. Anyway, further down the road, and absolutely nothing to do with the demolition or the upgrade of Leeming Lane, was a notorious case where a chap running a sort of distance learning establishment in 2008, he and his missus got £16 million of taxpayers' money, which they seem to do nothing with it, which has anything to do with education. With £16 million, I mean, that's a phenomenal, phenomenal lot of cash. He spent 600,000 buying some GGs, and as if that wasn't bad enough, he then blew 900,000 betting on them and losing. At one time, I think he owned several £1 million to one of the big bookmakers. For his pains, he got 7 years jail. Although he too feels that he was hard done by, and he has a little web page now on the internet. Going down through Leeming Bar, through Leeming and to Londonderry. Just before you go into Londonderry, on the left hand side was a huge house called Newton House. And it was the centre of an enormous estate. Every farm, every house, every building was owned by the proprietors of Newton House. It was owned by the same fellow we've talked about before, the Duke of Cleveland. It wasn't exactly a hunting lodge, it was far too big. But in essence it was a fox hunting estate, although it raised a large amount of revenue in rent. I mean, the Duke of Cleveland, he inherited a fortune. Increased his fortune by investment in the railways. He was seriously rich. You know, he was a sort of, I don't know, the Russian oligarch of his day, albeit a local lad. He had, Wynyard Hall, which is, they had another main house in Northern Ireland. A beautiful, great big place. I don't know whether it's still there. But of course, Wynyard Hall was sitting on a coalfield, the Durham coalfield, which brought riches beyond your wildest dreams. His estate stretched from Darlington to Westmoreland, which was I think it was 83 miles from one side to the other. You just can't imagine it. Although most of it is still owned by Raby Castle, the Raby Castle estates. I actually remember driving over Stainmore and you could pick out the farms because they were all beautifully whitewashed. I don't think they are now, but these farms stood out a mile. The farms belonging to the Raby Castle estate. It seems highly probable that the Duke of Cleveland gave Londonderry its name with his associations with Londonderry and Northern Ireland. I think the estate there was called Mount Stewart. Anyway, you can look it up on the internet. Now, his first wife died in 1807 after having 8 kids in 20 years. But 6 years later, the Duke of Cleveland, he caused a right scandal. He married downstairs, as it was called in those days. He married the eldest daughter of his gardener, actually the head gardener, a fellow called Robert Russell. She was a 34-year-old beauty. I mean, she was one of the most beautiful women of her generation in aristocracy. Everybody sings her praises in that way. And she'd been the mistress of the owner of Coutts Bank. But having had 8 kids with his first wife, with his second wife, they didn't have any, not surprisingly. And he died in 1842. And Elizabeth, his second wife, obviously she became the Dowager Duchess, but a bit like that, the woman on Downton Abbey. And she took up residence at Newton House. She died in 1861, I think, and having had no children, the house passed to either her brother, who was a captain in the Royal Navy, Captain Robert Russell, or to one of his sons. By this time, Newton House was very firmly in the Russell family's hands. In 1890, the main man at Burniston Church, what they call the patron of the living, that doesn't mean the living or dead, it means the living was the sort of the money that the church raised. His main responsibility, of course, was to appoint vicars, and usually the aristocracy had somebody in their family who didn't know what to do with himself. Most of them joined the army or the forces of some description, but a sizable number of them became vicars. It would seem that this fella, William Darby Russell, appointed one of his relatives, I think it was called Henry Vane Russell, to become Vicar of Burniston. He eventually moved to Wem, where he became Vicar of Wem, where he died. In 1919, the whole of the Newton House estate was put up for sale, and probably because they needed the money. I suspect one of the Russells had died, and the whole place was divided up. And these next pages are just about the sale. What was being sold of it. Absolutely amazing how much they owned. The last of the Russells was a Miss M.E. Russell. She wasn't the last of the original. She was the last of the Cleveland dynasty, and of course she had no children. She died in 1927, and the hall was sold off. It was sold to a chap from Sunderland, and he opened it up as a really posh hotel. I mean, Newton House had a grass strip aerodrome in its day, and there were some aeroplanes there owned by the Yorkshire Flying Services, they were called, and if you had a pilot's license you could go and hire one and just have a spin round, have a quick mosey across the red car and up and down the coast and then come back. A bit like hiring a car if you have a driving licence. It was a posh hotel until 1937, when obviously trouble was brewing, and when we all think of the 1939 to 1945 war, but they knew it was coming long before that. And in 1937, Newton House was requisitioned by the Royal Air Force, parkland became Leeming Air Base, which it still is today. It's one of these frontline air bases, or it was until quite recently a frontline air base. It's now for training purposes. But during the war, like many of these big houses which had been requisitioned by the armed forces, Newton House was absolutely trashed, and at the end of the war, it just sat there for ages, nobody knowing what to do with it. And in 1956, the place was flattened, and there's now a sort of garage, a transport place on the site. Now, Leeming and Londonderry having been bypassed at this time, there was a little lane led from Leeming across to Exelby, went across a bridge called Cowfold Bridge, and as part of the upgrade from A1 to A1M, the bridge obviously wasn't wide enough, and rather than just widen it or build a new bridge, it was demolished, and that little lane comes to a sort of dumb end on either side of the A1M, and these next are just a couple of shots of Cowfold Bridge, the bridge itself, and looking down what was then the A1 dual carriageway. Thixon Grange, again a very nice house. I know it's Georgian or what it is, but it is absolutely hard up against the road. It was hard up against the A1 dual carriage. It must have been really noisy, and it sits behind a great big concrete barrier put there to protect it. And is lower than the road itself. I mean, the road is about level with the first floor. An interesting incident happened there, in that a lorry jackknifed and whacked into the concrete barrier, and of course closed the road, and lots of police descended on it. But the people in the place weren't overly concerned about the accident. They were more concerned about the fact that they were growing cannabis in a greenhouse out the back. So the story goes. And but just up the road from there was a farm in Londonderry which was growing cannabis on an industrial scale. Well, the near miss at Thixon Grange, I suspect, put the wind up, because they shifted the whole operation to some great big turkey sheds at East Halsey, which a village in a remote countryside, and the turkey sheds were even remote by East Halsey standards, up a little lane called Goosecroft Lane. The Custom and Excise had got wind of a tax fiddle to do with red diesel. I won't explain what red diesel is, but for those of you who live in the countryside, be well aware of it. Basically, it's tax-free fuel for farmers, but you're only allowed to use it in agricultural vehicles. So they set off to this Goosecroft Lane, pursuing this tax fiddling business to do with red diesel. And when they got there, of course, absolutely confounded to find these turkey sheds packed out with cannabis plants, thousands of them, and they were being tended by some illegal immigrants from Vietnam who'd been locked in. There were lots of these. They were brought from Vietnam, smuggled into the country illegally, and of course blackmailed or threatened that if they didn't do what they were told, they would be exposed and shipped back again. It must have been a terrifying existence for them. Anyway, the upshot was that the perpetrators were all jailed. And so this is just Thixton Grange. That farm there is where they were growing cannabis. It's a long time ago now. I'm sure the current residents aren't involved in anything like that. Opposite Burnish Lane Ends stood a rather nice house called Street House. Very big whitewash place. And it was just bought up and flattened in 2009, and this is a photograph of it. Further down was Oak Tree Services, which stood opposite Oak Tree Farm. Oak Tree Farm is still there on the right hand side of the road, the west side of the road, and Oak Tree Services stood on the other side. It was a Shell filling station, and again it was demolished in 2009, and the remains lie under the new A1M. Down the road from Oak Tree Services was a terrace of houses. There were 7 of them. Hope Town Terrace it was called. Who chose the name I have no idea. Probably very apt. Because it was in the middle of nowhere. It was probably built, and it was built around about the 1830s. And stagecoaches were still running, and although not for very much longer. So the people who lived there probably worked in the stagecoach business or hostelry business, or on the other side of the road was a nursery which also employed 4 or 5 people in their gardens, called Hope Nurseries, or Hope Town Nurseries. The farm is still there. It's called Hope Farm. It still exists alongside the old A1. But at some time, probably in I don't know, it would be the 1930s maybe, the first 5 houses were all bashed into one and became a cafe called the Quick Grill Cafe, which was very popular. It had a big car park. and around about 1996 ownership changed, and it became known as the Little Bistro, if you can remember it. And this is just a photograph of the Little Bistro during its demise, when it was about to be flattened. And at the bottom end of Hopetown Terrace, the what had been the Oak Tree Inn, although it hadn't been the Oak Tree Inn for a long, long time, it became a private dwelling called Sunnyside. And the whole place was flattened in 2009. Next to Hopetown Terrace was Lodge Farm. It was a relatively modern building, it had no historical significance, and it too was flattened in 2009. And these are just some documents relating to Hopetown Terrace and the Lodge Farm area. A couple of fields further down on the same side was the New Inn, which we've already mentioned, and these are just some photographs of the New Inn when it was standing derelict, awaiting demolition, again in 2009.